Well, you're watching Q&A where the audience asks the questions, and I am not Tony Jones. I don't even look like Tony Jones, and I'm not even going to pretend to be Tony Jones. But today, this afternoon, is going to be a very interesting panel. The question is, how will animal welfare expectations impact food production in the next 5 to 10 years? Now, how we're going to run this afternoon's panel session is each of the presenters are going to present to you for about 5 minutes, no more, and then we're going to have some roving mics. The staff will be running around with microphones, and this is your Q&A, so it's your chance to ask the questions, put the case. I will take that as a comment at times, and it's going to be very interesting. But I am going to do some introductions, firstly, as the people come up to speak. Our first speaker today is Chris Nixon. Chris is a beef and dairy producer from Orbost, operating a 950 hectare property, managing 1,500 hectares in East Gippsland, and Chris's properties contain 500 dairy cows, 1,000 beef cattle, which comprises of self-replacing Angus herd, mainly producing store cattle for the feedlot market. Chris has been involved with the VFF at a range of levels since 1987, from branch secretary to policy council over that time. Chris has a short history of experience in the VFF Economics Committee, and is currently the VFF representative on the Cattle Council of Australia, the Southern Australia Beef Research Council, and Chris is the outgoing president of the VFF Livestock Group. Can you warmly welcome Chris Nixon?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Today, as I stand here before you, there is no better group of farmers to lead animal welfare than the people standing in front of us. We spend a small fortune every year on research and development to bring R&D to bring animal welfare issues to the fore. We employ 40 full-time equivalent in scientists to make sure that we are world's best practice when it comes to animal welfare issues. We do improve practices. We have seen improving practice over a long time, but the reality is it's the consumers who ultimately decide the animal welfare practices we do. I'll give you 3 short examples. Eggs. 25 years ago, eggs were eggs. But today you have a range of eggs from free range, barn laid, and even still caged. Sow stalls. Sow stalls will be phased out by the industry by 2017. And the industry is moving rapidly, that it'll probably happen before that. Mulesing. 25 years ago, nearly everyone mules. Today, it's only 8% of the farming population across Australia that do not mule today. This is a very contentious issue, but the reality is, in mulesing, there is no economic driver for farmers to take the economic cost to cease mulesing. These drivers are not clear. We have animal welfare groups out there concerned that this is not being addressed properly, but there is no silver bullet out there. We can breed plainer sheep, that takes generations, and there is no magic bullet to stop the problem of fly strike, breech strike. We try and engage with animal welfare groups. Today, this forum is a good example of trying to engage with animal welfare groups. Going forward, farmers will be more about communicating, informing and educating about how and why we do our businesses. And we're trying to align farming best practice and community expectation. That is the only way we can come together as a society. Just to have these mindless debates is pointless. The other way we've been engaging with animal welfare groups is through the development of the standards and guidelines process. In these, industry and animal welfare groups are laying out their plans on how the standards for Australian production systems should go in the future. There's robust discussion, and at the end of the day, there'll be common sense ground reached over the range of issues. Not everyone gets exactly what they want. Cattle Council gives ground, the animal welfare has to give ground, but at the end of the day, the standards are high and they're good and they're improving. As farmers, we are the only nation that go out beside our nation to improve animal welfare practice in other countries. Is it ideal? No, it's not ideal. But the reality is, in Indonesia, no other countries in there try and improve animal welfare standards. It's the same with a range of countries around the world. Australians are in there trying to lift animal welfare standards, not only in Australia, but also around the world. And I implore you to keep that in mind as this debate goes on. Thank you.
Very good, thank you, Chris. It's my pleasure to give a warm welcome to Glenys Oogjes from Animals Australia. Glenys has been Executive Director of Animals Australia for the past 24 years, a long-time animal advocate. Glenys was instrumental in the lobby effort to establish the first ever Senate Standing Committee on Animal Welfare in Australia in 1983. Glenys is a member of several committees, including the National Consultative Committee on Animal Welfare, advising the Federal Minister for Agriculture, a number of institutional animal ethics committees, and the Code Liaison Group, which determines the national policy and code relating to animals in research. She is also a long-standing member of the Victorian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee and represents the animal view on many special purpose government initiated review and writing groups. Can you please give a warm welcome to Glenys Oogjes?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Chris. And thank you for asking me along, the VFF for asking me along to participate today. As you know, Animals Australia is often portrayed as the enemy of farmers, particularly by the rural press. The supposed battle between us probably sells newspapers, but similarly it's a great source of frustration to me that Animals Australia is routinely projected as being radical or extreme. So I welcome this short opportunity to set the record straight and also to identify where I believe that a clear bridge can be built between us. Firstly, to address the misnomers though, I'm sure that you'll agree that it's not extreme or radical to want animals to be treated humanely. It's both nonsensical, I think, and counterproductive to portray a position as being radical or extreme when it's a position that the vast majority of the community hold. Animals Australia has supporters in all walks of life, including from the rural community. And if you look at our policies, they're really no different to major other respected animal welfare organisations, such as the World Society for the Protection of Animals, Compassionate World Farming in Europe, RSPCA here and abroad. And so I'm also sorry to disappoint you that we have no affiliation or association with PETA, and I don't oppose guide dogs being used at all. So these are misnomers that are around and they're just not true. It's understandable that in recent years Animals Australia has made itself unpopular with some in the rural community, of course, through investigating and exposing treatment of animals that perhaps you would prefer, many people would prefer, hadn't been exposed. This investigative role, this expose role, was never envisaged by me that that's the way Animals Australia would go, but we were left with no choice. For over 2 decades, Animals Australia primarily worked as a political lobbying organisation, providing representation on many of the review processes, and particularly the codes of practice. Having sat on many of those reviews, on the committees that reviewed the codes over many years, and providing representation through that, I've found that there has not been any major, significant, meaningful advances from them, even when we have independent welfare science and international precedents, for that matter, that have determined already that the practices are cruel and no longer acceptable. The routine position of industry representatives on those committees has been to oppose change. That's been the default position, even when change is obviously in the interests, I think, of the industry, and crucial, of course, to retain consumer support, which is what Chris was talking about. Animals Australia has long expressed its desire for a more proactive stance to be taken by farming representative bodies on welfare issues. Many of the issues that we've raised and made ourselves unpopular with farmers, of course, for exposing, have been known and accepted by industry bodies for decades. Yet proactive measures have only been taken when publicly exposed and faced with a crisis because of public concern. Indonesia was a classic case. MLA's own reports for a decade had indicated that there were problems with particularly the time around slaughter in the Mark I box. We now have a situation where Australia's CVO, Australian government, has determined that they're cruel, the Mark I box, and have banned it from use. Yet, of course, they should never have been installed in the first place. MLA suggested too, in 2010, or a report to MLA, that stunning of animals, cattle, before slaughter was an aspirational goal in Indonesia. Yet through Animals Australia work, right now, 70% of the facilities that our cattle are going to in Indonesia have stunning. Last year, this time last year, it was less than 5%. Similarly, as a result of our investigations in the Middle East over the last 10 years, or 9 years, the importing countries have now at least have to meet OIE standards, minimum as they are. And that, of course, is stopping some of the most brutal practices that we exposed. Looked upon in this light, I would suggest that Animals Australia should not be seen as the enemy, but rather as an ally, as it's our work that has led to your animals being treated more humanely. But it should not take a crisis with all the negative aspects that brings along to generate change. If your industry leaders have vision and prepared to acknowledge where change is needed, crisis would be avoided or averted. Leaders with vision would also urge you to consider that just because some husbandry practices or production methods have been accepted for generations of producers, that doesn't automatically make them right. Such leaders would also urge you to embrace change, as it can bring benefits not only for the animals but for the producers, and they would advise you that meeting the expectations of consumers regarding standards of care is critical in retaining general support. I do firmly believe that common ground can be found between us though, common ground that benefits your constituents and ours. For example, industry representatives consistently argue against change on the basis of increased production costs and that consumers may not be prepared to meet those costs. I think this statement has no factual foundation, as we still have a largely uninformed community. If both the rural community and animal welfare groups unite in educating people as to the benefits of investing in better welfare, it's a message we can speak as one on.
1 minute.
Well, 1 minute and the elephant in the room. Yes, Animals Australia highlights vegetarianism as a valid dietary option. And why do we do that? We do it because we are an animal advocacy organisation. We exist to represent their interests, and therefore the greatest fear, and I think it's appropriate therefore that we highlight a legitimate choice that people can make on behalf of animals. If the greatest fear of rural industries is people moving to a plant-based diet, then the strongest advice I can provide is to ensure that your farming practices are humane, meeting community expectations. After all, that's the most compelling reason people decide on vegetarianism. There may always be points of difference between us, but there are also clear benefits in finding a single position that we can all agree on. What is not in dispute is that all animals share the ability to suffer. Surely then the obvious point of agreement we can reach is that all animals raised for food should be provided with quality of life and equal legal protection against cruel practices. We'd welcome you joining us in making this goal a reality, as undoubtedly it's the one that the public will embrace. Achieving it would bring great benefits as well, not only for animals. First and foremost, you would retain the support of those most important to you in the future, and that's the broader community, as has already been acknowledged. But perhaps significantly, you would hear much less of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenys. I'm now going to welcome Paul Hemsworth from Animal Welfare Institute. Paul Hemsworth is a professor in the Melbourne School of Land and Environment at the University of Melbourne and is a director of the Animal Welfare Science Centre, a joint centre of the University of Melbourne, Monash University, Department of Prime Industries Victoria, and the Ohio State University. He is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Animal Science, Ohio State University. Paul has had an extensive research career studying the behaviour and welfare of farm and companion animals. He is particularly recognised for his research on human-animal interactions, but also his research on housing and husbandry efforts on animal welfare and behaviour. Paul teaches subjects such as animal behaviour and animal welfare to undergraduates and master's students at the University of Melbourne. Please give Paul Hemsworth a warm welcome.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here this afternoon. My response to the question of how will animal welfare expectations impact on production in the next 5 to 10 years, I would suggest that animal welfare expectations have impacted on food production, and they will continue to do so in the future. And we've just heard a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen in the industry here in Australia, the livestock industry. The voluntary phase out of gestation stalls by 2017. When we look at the egg industry, I think we're talking about 35% of eggs, shell eggs that are in the retail market. About 35% of those eggs come from free-range systems, so it's been quite a substantial increase in free-range production. The issue of mulesing, substantial pressure's been on mulesing in terms of looking at alternatives, in terms of looking at pain relief. They're just some of the examples, I think, where animal welfare expectations have influenced animal production. I think it's useful when we think about the changes that we may see in the future to think about how decisions on whether or not an animal practice is acceptable or not is made. In other words, whether or not it's right or wrong. Now that question's not a factual question, it's one of ethics. So it's an ethical question. Science cannot solve that question, but science provides the facts that assist us in addressing that question. So science can tell us about the impact of the husbandry procedure or the housing procedure on the animal. The issue of whether or not it's acceptable or not is an ethical question, and I'll come back to that. Within science, there are several techniques that we use to assess animal welfare. One basically involves looking at how well the animal adapts to its environment. So basically looking at the biology of the animal to tell us whether or not the animal is coping. The second approach is really trying to assess animal emotions or animal feelings. Very difficult, but we use tests such as preference tests where we allow animals to make choices in terms of what they like or dislike. Getting back to that question of how individuals may make decisions about whether or not something is acceptable or not, certainly what science tells us about the impact on the animal is part of that equation. That's one of the considerations. But there are a range of other considerations. For some, it may be their adherence to reasons or moral principles such as, say, an animal rights view or a utilitarian view. So there's some philosophical considerations for many. There's also religious and cultural beliefs that influence whether or not individuals will accept a particular practice. And of course, there's the broader harms and benefits of the practice. Broader harms and benefits beyond the animal, environmental influences, economic influences, and social effects. And policy groups, like government groups making decisions about animal welfare codes or animal welfare standards, utilise some of those considerations. And we only have to look at slaughtering practices here in Australia, where some abattoirs have an exemption to slaughter sheep without stunning. So there's a range of considerations that we utilise when we make decisions about whether or not a practice is acceptable. So I would suggest that there are a number of drivers of welfare change. You're looking at your watch, Andrew.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, oh, very good. There are a number of drivers of welfare change, but I would suggest that it's the attitudes of the general public to farm animal welfare that are going to be increasingly influential in influencing livestock production practices in the future. So those attitudes will influence how we manage, how we house animals in the future. And there is two mechanisms, I think, whereby those effects will occur. There'll be direct effects through the consumer, and the consumer is part of the general public, so the consumer's attitude to animal welfare issues is likely to be influential at times, together with a number of other considerations in their purchasing behaviour. And then there'll be the indirect influences. Indirect influences of the public and the consumer. Those influences will occur through government making decisions on behalf of the community about animal welfare codes or standards. And the second indirect process will be standards that are going to be set for the product by processors or retailers on behalf of their consumers. So governments or processors and retailers will make decisions on behalf of their constituents. And I think in order to get a rational and progressive improvement, genuine improvement in animal welfare, and that doesn't always occur, I think, when we look at some of the changes that have occurred at times. Science and education are probably critical. Science and community values should underpin our animal welfare standards. If they don't underpin our animal welfare standards, then I think there's going to be concern. There'll be no rational progress in terms of animal welfare standards. So what we need to do is we need alignment. We need alignment between science and industry practices, and that will require industry education and compliance with standards or codes. We also need alignment between industry practices and the majority public attitudes. Right, so there needs to be an alignment between industry practices and community values. And that requires public education also.
30 seconds.
Right, I'm getting there. And that public education should be in terms of the practice that's being used, as well as the reasons, the practical reasons for using that practice, as well as what science tells us about the impact of that practice on the animal. So I think the steps that we need for genuine improvements in animal welfare, as well as achieving public, consumer and industry confidence, and we need all of that if we're going to have a rational progression in this area. The key steps are research addressing contentious issues, industry and public education around those research results, understanding community attitudes or community values, because community values together with science should underpin our animal welfare standards.
And time is up.
And industry compliance, and that's it.
Very good. I'm a bit of a ruthless chair here, but we've got a lot to get through. I want to get to the debate. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Maria Mercurio. Maria has been Chief Executive Officer of the RSPCA of Victoria since 2002, prior to which she was CEO of Moorland City Council. With a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and a Master of Business Administration, Maria has enjoyed a successful and varied career in business and commerce in the United States and Australia. During her management career, Maria has had experience in the finance and retail industries as well as time with the CSIRO. She's also worked in the food manufacturing sector, combining her career in operations management with running a small hobby farm in rural New South Wales. Please give a warm welcome to Maria Mercurio, RSPCA.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you all again for having me as part of your panel today. I think it's an absolutely critical debate, obviously, for all of you to be having. Victoria has a diverse landscape and a varied climate, so Victorian farmers obviously face many challenges for the future. How farmers manage those changes whilst also maintaining a high standard of animal welfare will be crucial to their success. As climate variability or climate change predictions indicate longer droughts and more severe floods in Victoria, and you've seen recent evidence, I know, of both of those, farmers must manage climatic pressures on their landscape, on their feed sources, on their water. They must also continue to ensure their animals' welfare under those changing conditions. Comprehensive preparedness strategies include plans for managing animals on farm, building and maintaining feed reserves, ensuring adequate water supply, managing the environment, and building up financial reserves. But as big a challenge as climate change or climate variability will be, we see that the bigger challenge to the future of Victorian agriculture will be supplying the changing and growing population. Our population is growing and becoming more culturally diverse, so Victorian producers will be under increasing pressure to provide sufficient and suitable produce to maintain their share of this changing market. The consumer demand for ethically produced and welfare-friendly food is also growing. Consumers are voting with their wallets, and pressure on retailers to stock ethically produced, welfare-friendly, clearly labeled farm produce has already led to some major changes, and will continue to do so. Our RSPCA-approved farming scheme and Choose Wisely initiatives are part of the response to this consumer pressure. This pressure is passed down from retailers to their suppliers, the farmers and producers. We believe that improving animal welfare is a good enough reason alone to continue to improve farming practices for the better. But when coupled with economic drivers, it makes even more sense. There are many opportunities during the life cycle of a farm animal to improve their welfare, on farm, during transport, and at slaughter. Public pressure is demanding improved welfare, and it makes good business sense for farmers to continue to respond to this pressure. Community concern for the welfare of farm animals prior to their products reaching the supermarket shelves is growing. Their awareness is increasing, and the issues they are discovering can be far from palatable. Where farm produce begins with the laying of an egg or the birth of a piglet, many thousands of animals a year are still subjected to poor welfare conditions. Layer hens and sows are not provided with the space required to exhibit natural behaviors. Chris touched on those issues earlier as well. International reform in these areas is leading the way for change in Australia. Newborn animals, such as bobby calves, the unwanted byproduct of the dairy industry, may be deprived of their mother's milk and care and transported while still unfit to travel to slaughter. We continue to work with government and industry to improve conditions for these young animals. Juvenile animals can experience painful husbandry procedures such as disbudding, dehorning, mulesing. Continued research into pain relief and alternative methods is essential. The daily life of an adult farm animal may not be as welfare friendly as it could be, mastitis, lameness, and inappropriate handling affecting dairy cattle, for example. We support recent efforts, ongoing efforts by the dairy industry to improve dairy cattle welfare and believe strongly in the power of education to facilitate change. A farm animal's life should be ended humanely, as close to farm as possible, without it having to endure the stressors of transport. But this is not always the case, with thousands of animals traveling many kilometers to abattoirs either interstate or overseas. The very public exposure of this issue last year, Glenys alluded to that, of course, continues to resonate strongly with the community and has changed many people's views of farming forever. The RSPCA applauds farmers who acknowledge their duty to animals and society by implementing good welfare standards, whether this is through RSPCA-approved farming schemes or otherwise, and we look forward to the opportunity to work with more farmers in the future as they move towards more welfare-friendly practices. We are not against the farming of animals for human benefit. We are against the harming of animals for human benefit. We believe that the needs and wants of humans for animal products can be met without compromising animal welfare. The wider community, your consumers, are also coming around to this point of view, and we believe that prioritizing animal welfare and acknowledging the consumer's right to expect this will be one of the biggest influences on future farming practices.
1 minute.
I thought I would finish by quoting Hugh Worth when he opened your VFF Livestock Conference in 2004. And he said, "In truth, community leadership on the ethical use and management of animals, whether domestic, wild, feral, or pest species, ultimately rests with both organizations." And he was talking about both the RSPCA and the VFF. So the RSPCA certainly looks forward to working with the farming community to continue to drive best animal welfare outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, so you're on Q&A, so this is where the audience asks the questions, and we'll ask all the questions to be reasonably short, but I'm going to kick off to you, Maria. Have the supermarkets had a positive or negative impact on animal welfare? I noticed you said that consumers are voting with their wallets, whilst farmers are being forced to provide food in an environment where the down and stay down is coming on. So what's your view on that?
I think for the most part, supermarkets have provided a very positive influence on animal welfare. We've heard today, if you walk into the supermarket now, you have a choice of many different eggs, for example. Barn laid, cage laid, free range, organically produced. You have a choice of pork, buy free range pork, or pork that's not free range. Chicken meat, turkey meat, and just a number of products that are now showing that welfare practices can be embedded into production systems with ultimate benefit to animals. So I think overall supermarket business, or the supermarket pressure, has certainly aided animal welfare.
Very good. Now I'll get you to put your hand up if you're asking a question.
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
There is no doubt that supermarkets have had an impact, both positive and negative. You know, the idea that we can do this profitably is the question that everyone's on their mind. We know that there's way less farmers today, and part of that reason is that we're not making the money that we were 20 years ago. The reality is, for a beef producer like myself, I'm getting paid less today by about 5% in real terms than I was in 1992. So although we like to say we've got high prices, the prices aren't keeping up with inflation, and you can't expect us to, in a first-class society, to keep maintaining first-class animal welfare outcomes if we're not being paid to do it, because we're competing against third-world countries who do not do this, and that's the brutal reality of the marketplace we're in.
Can I say just in general regard to supermarkets, I think that the big ones we're talking about, Coles and Woolies, what they have that perhaps is only secondary to yourselves is that they have direct an understanding, they're a barometer of what's going on in the community because they're dealing directly with the customers. And so I do think they have a very important role to play. But I reiterate what I said in my initial remarks though, that in fact what's required if we're going to start talking about higher welfare and therefore the costs of producing that, which Chris is talking about, or even maintaining existing, but to pay for that, that does come down to education, and each one of us has talked about that. And what I'm suggesting is that as the community becomes more and more aware of practices, they won't like some of them, but they will start to understand that in order to change those practices and provide animals with a greater quality of life, then they've actually got to pay a bit more. Instead at the moment, what I would suggest to you is that the animals are paying the price.
But surely, Glenys, that down and staying down because we all eat meat. Is the consumer really concerned?
Well, we don't all eat meat. But
just quoting the ad. Just quoting the ad.
Sorry.
Can I say something there, Anne? Whoops.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a trapdoor here. So if you don't like me, you just press the button. It's a setup. You should have been sitting here, Glenys. I forgot what I was going to say. No, I haven't. It's very interesting as to whether or not, if the consumer has a choice, whether or not the consumer will pay for improved animal welfare. And that's fairly questionable, I think. And some of the work that's been done here in Australia suggests that they're not greatly willing to pay for increased welfare. But where the community, I mean, if you look at some of the work that's been done looking at attitudes to animal welfare and community behaviours, you know, behaviours like lobbying a politician on an animal welfare issue or joining the RSPCA or talking about animal welfare in a social setting, attitudes to animal welfare of the individual is well correlated with community behaviours, less well correlated with buying behaviour, because there's a whole host of other considerations involved in buying behaviour.
I would suggest, though, that we're already seeing that change. That is, that more people are, for example, the quite incredible increase in the sale of non-cage eggs over the recent years, and increasingly free-range chicken as well is growing very quickly each year. But I'd go back to what I'd said earlier, that I think that as the community becomes more engaged and understanding of the practices, that will start to change, and that attitude will more correlate with what they're going to pay for the products that they buy.
Very good. Now, if you'd like to ask, I'm going to take some questions here from the audience. If you want to ask a question, put your hand up high. So we've got a question there in the middle, and then we'll go to a question over here. So, question there in the middle. Please stand up as you speak.
I just want to ask, if everybody's so concerned about animal welfare, why are we not concerned about the drinking water and the quality of? Recycled water is not suitable for calves under 12 months of age. I haven't researched other animals yet. The farmers are putting up with
Are we asking a question or a comment? I'm going to be very, very ruthless.
Well, it's a question, but farmers are putting up with the green sludge coming from the city, the toxic waste into our river systems, and they're blaming the cattle, the manure, where natural emissions take care of themselves. So how are we going to reach a happy medium where we can improve the quality of water without relying on recycled water that's not suitable?
Okay, so recently we've been blamed for all the terrible water when there's a lot of pollution coming out of our cities. What do you think?
I'm not an expert on water quality, I have to say. It's not an issue that I can speak intelligently on.
Okay, I'll take that.
Except within the code of practice at this point in time, there's reference to clean potable water for animals. So if there's a welfare issue there, we should be onto it.
Okay, over here.
Yeah, basically, Glenys, who's first up, and others could comment, and I'd draw your attention to something.
Direct it to the panel and I'll steer it out.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to know how the animal activists people can justify their practice, which is often publicised, and that's what they do it for, of flouting the law by breaking into premises illegal and illegally damaging facilities. Now, firstly, how do they justify that sort of action? And we're all aware of it, the piggeries and chook houses, and who should wear the cost of these operations? I'm sure they don't. And just as a comment on that, the action a couple of years ago of an activist putting the ham into the feedlot at Portland that destroyed an industry for a whole series of export sheep to go to the Middle East, cost an absolute fortune. And I want to know how they justify this sort of action in their push for turning us all off eating meat. Who should pay for it when they do it?
Animals Australia doesn't support using violent or criminal damage at all, and that's not, we don't do that, we don't support that, we don't actually think that it's acceptable, but also I'd question whether it's effective in bringing the community along in regard to animal welfare.
Okay, so a person going into an Indonesian abattoir and filming, wouldn't be classed as trespass?
No. In fact, in that instance, Lynn White, my colleague, as you all know, went in there with cameras. It wasn't a covert operation at all. There was no illegality at all. And of course, as you know, in any event, what she brought back was just amazing to think that we could have been sending our animals to that fate for some 10 years prior. So absolutely justified.
Maria, of course the RSPCA doesn't engage in that kind of activity, but do you think that kind of activity has got any place where they're breaking the law or trespassing or interfering with the business?
No, certainly the RSPCA would not support any illegal activity. It's not what we do. We're not the protesters. We certainly would not legitimize in any way, shape, or form illegal activity or trespass. Do I think it has a place? I don't. And again, I don't think it's effective in terms of educating the community or influencing public opinion, except in a negative way. Okay,
we have a...
But we are aware of animal activist groups through Facebook and other means that there are groups out there that talk about bringing FMD into this country to try and shut down animal farming in this country. Now, if you want an animal welfare outcome that's perverse, you do that, because the suffering, pain and suffering, if that was to happen, is huge. And if you've got groups talking about it on Facebook, then in today's society, you cannot be sure that someone's mad enough not to do it.
So then how do the more moderate groups, such as the RSPCA and Animals Australia, we'll put you in the moderate groups this afternoon, how do you dissuade, how do you convince people that doing something like bringing an exotic disease or trespassing is actually not the way to go forward? How do you walk that line between trying to bring an argument forward without having those people who perceive you and want to jump on and go the extra step?
Look, we can't dictate or even influence what others do, just as you would have difficulty doing. What we do hope to do, though, is through providing good information in our campaigns, which are raising awareness of the key concerns that we're working on, factory farming, that is intensive farming, and live animal export and cruel, painful husbandry procedures, by bringing that to the fore, by trying to have changes made through the consumer pressure, but also through community pressure and government changes. By doing that and showing that things can change, I would hope that that sort of thing would dissipate. That is, that by making real change, people won't be frustrated, which of course is the root of the cause why people are actually doing or threatening to do some things. So I think that it really behoves us all to ensure that there is real change for animals so that we can reduce the suffering. Present time, we have double standards in this country in regard to legal protection, and I just touched on that in my address. in that at the moment, so many cruel farming practices are exempted from the law. What I'd suggest is that we should have an even playing field. All animals can suffer. They should be treated in a similar way. That leads to real frustration.
And Paul, is that true? Cruel farming practices exempted from the law, in your knowledge?
What particular practices are we talking about?
When I say that, just to explain, what I mean is codes of practice, the national codes of practice, actually document things like tail docking and mulesing and keeping animals in tight confinement, intensive conditions, that is hens in battery cages where they can't even properly flap their wings, can't have all the behavioural requirements that are there. So those things occur under codes of practice. If you comply with those codes of practice, which document those practices, then that you're exempt from the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. Okay, I don't know whether people even realise that, and that means they're not judged.
We'll cross now to Paul. So
they're not judged against the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which is that things are can be that if something is causing unnecessary or unreasonable harm, you can be prosecuted, but that's not the case when it comes to things under codes of practice.
I'll just trust Paul.
Let's just take some husbandry practices then. I think, and you used mulesing and then went on to tail docking. I think there's quite a substantial difference between tail docking and mulesing. Tail docking imposes a moderate acute stress response. We should be looking at pain relief. Mulesing's in a different situation. Mulesing was acceptable for many decades on the basis it was the lesser of two evils. And I suppose it was only recently when some of the research indicated the very substantial stress responses that mulesing without pain relief induced. And there's a substantial effort occurring now in terms of looking at alternatives. So I think that's where we're seeing a response, where there is a clear practice that substantially impacts on the welfare of the animal. Alternatives are being examined.
The point though is that farmers are not exempt from the Proctor Act. To say that we are is a furphy. If you undertake severe animal welfare abuse, you are prosecuted, and prosecutions occur every year. That is the reality. So to say that we are exempt from it is not right.
So just on this, I'm just thinking this. So if I'm driving down the road and the speed limit is 60 kilometres and I'm doing 70 kilometres because the community has expected that 60 kilometres, then I'm breaking the law. But if the community has set up welfare standards and you're going a step beyond saying, well, those welfare standards aren't acceptable in your view, but the law has said this, doesn't that sort of give me a bit of a concern about the other argument that you wouldn't enter premises? Because I'm just trying to think, where is the law? Have we got a degree level, or
Yeah, no, I'm saying the law at the present time provides two standards. Okay, if the codes didn't exist and they were therefore the exemption didn't exist, it's in Section 6 of the Act. It says that if you're complying with the Code of Practice, you're not subject to the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act cruelty provision, Section 9.
So Maria, does the law contain two standards?
The law contains minimum standards, and I think that's part of the point that Glenys is making. Codes of practice are minimum standards, and we see that for production animals, we see that for domestic animals. So people who are complying with the Code of Practice aren't necessarily implementing the best quality or level of husbandry even. They're very minimum standards. So while they're complying with those minimum standards, of course they can't be prosecuted.
So you're watching Q&A where the audience asks the questions. I've got a question over here from Meg Parkinson, I believe.
Before I ask my question, can I say that...
Are we taking a comment or a question, Meg? We're taking a question?
We're doing both.
A question?
Comment was made about the prices for free range. I was president of Free Range Egg and Poultry.
Meg, I'll take that as, I will take, I'm chairing the meeting, I will take that as a comment.
No, well, I haven't said it yet.
Yes, well, you're going to make a comment.
Yes, well, I will.
We've got a lot of people who could ask a question, so please ask a question.
All right, Glenys, your information is wrong, but the question is, at one stage when we were all doing the Animal Welfare Science Centre strategic plan, you did a presentation and you said on that strategic plan, on that presentation, that you picked issues based on the warm, fuzzy, the cute animals. I'm asking you whether you still pick your issues based on what the average person in the street would seem as warm and fuzzy and identify with.
Well, can I say that you're wrong too? For goodness sake, I was asked how we went about choosing which issues that we would deal with. And first and foremost, they are related to the cruelty, or I should say, the suffering, the severity of suffering, how long an animal suffers, and how many animals are involved. Of course, then, after you do that, you decide which issues may be able to be progressed. I didn't warm and fuzzy, for goodness sake, I didn't say that. There's no point in bashing your head up against a brick wall, but we do try to chip away at that brick wall.
Very good. I have a question.
Can I just make a comment? On the issue of free range, I mean, eggs produced free range come at a cost, and producers are willing to do that because they know in the marketplace they'll get a higher price. Occasionally they get a higher price. But the reality is, if there's a disease outbreak in free range, that entire shed is closed down and disposed of because all the birds are infected. In hen cages, you know, if there's a disease outbreak, it's a little bit caved. I mean, the reality is, you know, production systems all have good points and bad points, and we have to be mindful that when we look at something that could be warm and fuzzy like free range, it comes at a cost which has another perverse outcome. So.
I was just to say the same thing. Often when we move from some of the conventional systems to the alternative systems, we just change the nature of the welfare problem. So I think our challenge is for those systems that the industry thinks are economically feasible, we should be looking at ways of improving the welfare of animals in those systems. And I actually believe, and I've been influenced markedly by John Barnett, a late colleague of mine, that it's actually the design of the system, not the system per se, that is so important. And when we talk about the design of the system, we should also include the stock person in that system. They're the important things, I think.
Sorry, Meg. No, Meg, you've had your say. We've got a lot of other members. Yeah, that's right. Now, we've got a question here.
Rolling the risk.
Wayne Weller, Warrigal Branch. Just a question to Glenys or Maria on your views of farming people, whether you believe all farming people are cruel to animals and don't love their animals. Like we make our living with animals. We live with animals for all our life. We care for every single one of them. Occasionally we have things that are outside or on the peripheral of our management practices that we can't actually, you know, things happen in day-to-day life. We have live animals, we have dead animals, we have occasionally sick animals. We try to keep them all alive, but just your opinion on how farmers are.
Your opinion on farmers first. Are they cruel at heart?
I don't think so. We have enormous respect for farmers. The RSPCA has historically worked with production groups, with farmers, with primary producers of all sorts. We don't for a moment think that farmers are deliberately cruel. But often in society, I mean, whenever you're talking about social issues, for example, there are activists that lead the way. They raise awareness, they get the debate going, they get the rest of the community to start to think about other issues. The same is true of farming practices. Sometimes the way those issues are raised are by activists. Now, we don't agree with their tactics often, but at the same time, you have to admire the fact that they raise the community's awareness of issues. So we wouldn't for a moment say that all farmers are cruel. We would say that you need to keep working on prioritizing the animal welfare issues within your production systems.
So, Chris, do animal welfare activists have a role to play in lifting the debate?
Look, I have no problem with middle ground people having a debate. I mean, we do have a problem with extremists, everyone does. So the reality is that we need to be held to account, and I said in my presentation that we need to explain our practices better to a wider community so that farmer best practice and community expectation align. We don't need to have these confrontations that put our livelihoods at risk. And that's what we're talking about, because It's the lack of information to the wider community that's causing these problems. They've lost touch of, you know, to eat meat, something has to die. And people have forgotten how animals die. It's not a good look.
So Glenys, the question, of course, was put to you in the first place.
Do I think farms are cruel? No. It may be a little known fact that I was born and raised on a farm and my family is still on a farm. I don't hate them and I don't see them as cruel. And certainly, what I do think though is that while Chris is talking about the divide or the disconnect, if you like, that people don't know what really happens on the farm, I think the problem is that when people do start to find out, and I don't mean that they're ignorantly making these decisions, I think that they do care greatly about animal welfare. It's a natural thing. So 99% of people are for cruelty. That's what we expect and that's what the polls say. So I think that the issue is that there are routine issues that people are never going to accept. Live export, for example, and also intensive farming, where animals cannot do things that are natural, like caged hens, sows in stalls. We saw the reaction of the community that when they find out, they don't like it, and I don't think they ever will. What I think is that to some extent farmers have also been disconnected. They haven't had that social barometer close at hand, and I think that's happened since more and more people have been disconnected from farming.
Sorry, no, we've got more questions to go through. I'm going to be very ruthless here, but Glenys, you mentioned live exports. Now, in your opening address, you said 70% of those abattoirs are now stunning, so surely that's a reason that Australia being in the trade and perhaps the role of animal welfare is lifted. Perhaps that's an argument to keep the live trade export open. What would you say to that?
No, I wouldn't say that, but I'd go back and say the only reason that we now have 70% of the abattoirs where our Australian cattle are going into Indonesia stunning is because Animals Australia went there and exposed it and showed people what was actually happening. Showed farmers too, to be sure. Many farmers, cattle producers wouldn't have known that was happening either, but their industry body did. So I do think that, well, I'll leave it there.
I'm going to show you. Going to share the microphone with Mr. Nixon here.
Yeah, look, just on Indonesia, you know, there's no farmer that wasn't horrified by the footage of abuse that occurred in the lead up to slaughter. And the Mach 1 box was developed by MLA and was still in use in some abattoirs. You know, those are facts. But the reality is, before the Mach 1 box, there was no alternatives, and we were trying to move people forward. Mach 1 box, we're up to Mach 4 now in boxes overseas, and it's a progression. Now, do you deal with a few abattoirs, or do you try and move everybody? We were probably trying to be greedy, moving too many abattoirs to a better standard. So.
Okay, now we're going to take another question. We've got.
There was only 4 Mark 4 boxes in Indonesia, and in 100 abattoirs they had the Mark 1 boxes that are now judged cruel and were known to be cruel by MLA at least 5 years ago.
Okay, so we've got a question over here. This is where the audience asks.
Sandy Campbell from Wangaratta. My question is directed to Glenys. Why did the animal activist try and sheet home the blame to Australian producers through this Indonesian business? It was a third party that was related to this exercise. Why didn't you sheet it home to the Indonesians?
First and foremost, Animals Australia and it was the messenger, okay? We didn't make this happen, we actually exposed it. But essentially it wasn't the Indonesians as such, they were accepting our technology. The MLA Mark 1 box and subsequent boxes were designed, manufactured in Australia and put into Indonesia to be used, even training provided by MLA to be used.
So once you sell something, are you still responsible for what you've sold?
That's an ethical question that I think everybody here would need to answer, of course. But of course, what we were doing was raising animals in this country, selling them, making an industry out of it, and sending them to a fate that no one, I expect no one in Australia would accept. That is unethical, unacceptable, and I think it brought shame on Australia
So Paul, what do you think? Once you've sold something, are we responsible for something we've sold?
Yes, I do think we have a responsibility. I mean, it's a really difficult area. It's a bit like pet shops selling puppies or dog breeders selling puppies. Where does their responsibility cease? And I think this whole area of once the animal leaves the farm gate, whether it's transported locally and slaughtered locally or on-sold, or whether it's transported overseas, that whole issue of where the responsibility stops, I think it's a really difficult one. But I do think that farmers do have some level of responsibility in terms of what happens to those animals.
What do you think, Maria?
I absolutely think they have a responsibility, and it certainly is an ethical question. You know, I responded a little while ago to the question about do I think farmers are cruel? Absolutely not. And I think the majority of farmers, a great number of producers, were horrified at the situation they saw Australian cattle being put into and the way they were being handled. So I think that producers would accept that they have that ongoing responsibility to their animals beyond the farm gate.
Yes, Chris.
Well, I mean, the brutal reality about this, at least we are trying to do something about it. I mean, the two animal welfare groups, you know, beside me here have considerable resources of their own, and yet, you know, they do well on publicity, but they do very poorly in actual work on the ground. I mean, there is no resources put into helping MLA develop these things, and surely if they are concerned about these things and they have got bad practices, you know, what's the work that they're actually doing to help?
Okay, so Glenys, just a side question to that, because I know you'll be very defensive of that. Can I just ask you, the Indonesians are going to eat, whether we provide meat to them or not, they're still going to have a live export trade. Is it better for Australia to be involved in that trade that actually has a conscience to lift welfare on the back of your lobbying? Or is it better for us to pull out altogether and leave them just to source their live exports from India?
I'm not sure that will happen anyway. We currently only provide about 10% of the beef that they eat, and of course that's only the richer people over there. But putting that aside, we have to look to leading the world and having best practice. And we can grow animals in this country under our standards, under our animal welfare laws, and export and kill them here and export them. That's what we should be doing. We should be doing it for all of the countries that we're providing to at the present time, including the Middle East.
We also export knowledge, though, in our education. So you don't think we should be exporting best practice by being involved in the trade?
If that worked, that's great in theory. What I'm here to say to you, though, is that I've been involved in animal welfare movements for over 30 years, and all of those years I've been railing against the problems in regard to live export and what happens in importing countries. And we've been involved in all of that time, and it's only been since we've been exposing through video footage, bringing back to the Australian community, that then our industry representatives here have pushed for greater change.
So surely now 70% of the abattoirs are using stunning is working?
70% is not enough anyway. We're not even imposing a requirement for stunning. But in any event, there is so much handling prior, there's transportation, and we cannot control what's happening over there. We already have, and you probably all know, that earlier this year we brought back footage of breaches of the new system in Indonesia, and we've heard of another one just published recently. So we can't control what they're doing. We are much more able to control the welfare of our own animals in our own country instead of sending them to countries where there are no animal welfare laws.
So you're watching Q&A where the audience asks the questions. We've got one more question here and then one over here, and then unfortunately we're going to have to go to late line, I believe. So.
Frank Harper from the Glenys branch. I noticed the vegan protesters had a dog, and I wonder what they fed it on.
Now, for those who... I'll take that as a comment.
I asked the question what they're feeding their dog on. They're feeding it vegan food. Now, if you think that's ethical, you know, I'll go he, because dogs are not designed to eat vegetables, as far as I was aware.
I might point out the security guard did bring over some water for the dog, so the security guard's the champion of this. Now we've got a question over here, which will be our final question, and then I'll ask our panel session for some closing remarks.
can I say that ownership is the right to enjoy? If I was a car salesman and I sold you people a car, would I have the right to instruct you how to drive it? Because I have my children out there and I don't want them killed. I've been SES for 35 years. I've seen my fair share of dead people and cars killed. I don't have the right to tell you how to drive your car, and you're telling me that I would. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment, I think.
I don't think that's an appropriate analogy. We're talking about an animal that is produced, and we're talking about what responsibility the farmer has in relation to how that animal is treated subsequently. I mean, that analogy is not.
So how will animal welfare expectations impact food production in the next 5 to 10 years? So we'll have some closing comments. How will they?
I think we've heard today that there's a high level of concern, not only from animal welfareists and from academics, but also from the farming community, and I think those are positive signs. I'd like to think that over the next 10 years, farmers will become more and more tuned into, if you like, better welfare practices. And in some cases, it will be because the community demands it. I think there will be a far greater demand from the community, from consumers, for ethically produced food.
Paul?
I think animal welfare concerns will continue to increasingly influence animal production practices, along with a whole range of other considerations, environmental, etc. And I think the challenge for us is to get an alignment between science, industry practices and community expectations.
Glenys?
A vision for 10 years hence. You know, what I would really like would be to be able to see the farming community riding a wave of community support. And they could do that, you could do that, if a whole lot of things changed in that 10 years. We got rid of mulesing, we got rid of live export, we got rid of long distance transportation, we got rid of husbandry practices, painful husbandry practices without the use of pain relief. That would be wonderful. And then we could have a very different environment. We could all sit down and have a beer after the conference.
Well, coming from East Gippsland and watching the Tim industry deal with the green movement down there, I mean, there's never enough's never enough of it, what we've seen, and we are aligning community expectation and best practice. We're trying to do that. Unfortunately, as an individual, we can move fastly, but as an industry that is so diverse, we're like a rolling ball of water. You know, it takes a while to shift and change direction. So we are improving. We are reaching out to the community. We are trying to lift our standards, and it's an ongoing process. It won't be achieved in 10 years.
Well, you've been watching Q&A. You've been a great studio audience, and you have been a studio audience because we've been streaming live. Can you please thank Maria Mercurio, Paul Hemsworth, Glenys Oogjes, and Oogjes, Chris Nixon, and I'm not Tony Jones. I'm Andrew Broad. I am a feather duster, and and thank you very much. Please thank our panel.